So, hi everyone. I'm here today with Neil Whitaker. He's the Strategic Account Director for IMIMobile, which is now part of Cisco. So Neil, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. So you guys look after cloud communications, messaging, those kind of things, and it'd be good to sort of, I know you have interaction with collections teams as well as sort of like a much wider environment. But it'd be good to sort of just maybe first off, just explain a little bit about what you've seen over the last year in terms of remote working, digital conversions, those kind of things.
It's been a really interesting, challenging year, as everybody has seen and experienced. I think certainly in the contact center area, it's been a monumental change with a massive move for agents to be remote working. And what's interesting is some organizations saying that that's now going to be a permanent thing, which is going to be a really interesting position as the world comes back to normal and we see that mix of home working and office working. I think it is interesting. It's something that we've been talking about for years, that whole remote working piece. And it's taken the pandemic to sort of force people's hand to that and actually show that it can be done and can work. And it's amazing how seamless that seemed to be for a lot of organizations.
I mean, how ready do you think people were, and how ready do you think they are now after what's been like? It's been over a year now in terms of like putting all this stuff in place. I mean, what was the readiness level before, and where do you think we sit now in terms of like overall development? Because I mean, as you say, this stuff's been around for a while, but it feels like there's been a big push around implementing it.
Yeah, I think two things. One is in the early days, it would have been an impossible thing to do with all the great big platforms on premise, and trying to get that to be remote working was really challenging, and B was very difficult to do. But I think with cloud services, it was we had some customers that managed to do it within a couple of weeks. Really turning it around very quickly with all of the security, all of the things in place that were needed to enable that. And we're seeing now that it's quite a comfortable thing to do. And customer service is king. Customer service is the driving force for every organization. And I think there was always that worry that it was going to be a real challenge and that customer service would fall off. But I think people have seen that it works very well, not only from a customer perspective, but also from an agent's perspective. It's really interesting how the whole work-life balance seems to have improved dramatically for some organizations. But also, I think the use of some of the new technologies that are out there as well. So when you look at the messaging services that are available, be able to bring some of that whole end-to-end communications together. It's not just about being able to take a phone call anymore. It's how do you manage all of the messaging communication out there.
Yeah, and so are you seeing a shift? I mean, there's obviously a big push to try and get people off site, from a health and safety point of view, and that with that goes the calls as well. But then as you say, there's messaging that's coming as well. And what's the interplay between voice services and then messaging, and I suppose like mobile messaging, SMS messaging, those kind of things? And what's been the interplay between those two, and has that evolved in terms of like how things move together?
It's massively evolved.
Yeah.
And again, it's interesting what makes that seismic shift in people's perception and how to use some of these new technologies. And it's something that IMI have been pushing for many years, 20 years now since the company started. But we have seen a seismic shift over the year in terms of that whole strategy of messaging. So when you're trying to build a communication with a customer, and looking at all of those channels that have been around for a long time, but it's about how do you orchestrate those together. So how do you prevent people from calling in to your contact? and how do you enable the services that can be built to make that a much more seamless experience. So, for example, if you think about a collections process, whereas before it could have been something very stark with a warning letter, email, white mail going out. Now that can be much more managed with something like SMS or email, or that interplay between a sort of soft message and raising to a very hard message out to a customer.
Yeah. And do you think there's sort of like almost like different channels, I want to say channels, or different methods of communicating with people depending on the situation? So for example, I mean, the great thing about calls was it was almost like one size fits all. I mean, like we can all have a conversation with anyone about everything. We can answer a balance. We can talk about, we can go into really sort of like complex sort of, talking with, personal issues around vulnerability or difficulties making payments, those kind of things. But do you think with the new types of channels coming in, or the new methods of communication, do we need to segment it in terms of like, is there different ways of, do some things fit better on messaging versus, calls, and how are people thinking about that sort of segmentation, really?
I think there's a number of areas, a number of ways of looking at that. I think the first thing is, for any financial organization, is what can be done to prevent that a customer going into debt. So how can you sort of ease that communication? And what we're seeing at the moment is that much earlier intervention, but a much softer intervention. So rather than waiting for the debt to build up and then sending out an email or a letter or make a call, if you can start by sending an SMS or even a push message, for example. So in terms of cost and the availability of the channel, is it sometimes much easier and much quicker just to send someone a little reminder. We're all incredibly busy these days, so if you get to pay a bill or something's being missed, gentle reminder can be much more effective, can be much more appealing from the customer experience perspective. The debt doesn't build up, and also that engagement that you have with that customer is seen to be a much more softly approach. And it's from an organization's perspective, it's much more cost effective as well.
I mean, one of the things that really impressed me around the messaging has been almost like it's been described as almost like the asynchronous nature of messaging. The fact that you can send a message sort of now, and then they sort of like, and you might get back to it in sort of like half an hour, and then you sort of like, it's that sort of like delayed messaging, which I mean, is that got huge benefits of it? How does that kind of fit in terms of like I suppose call centers?
So that asynchronous messaging, again, people are very busy, that not always available, but if you can send a message that will sit on their phone, and let's be clear now, the whole world is moving to mobile engagement. Everybody has a phone, everybody wants to interact with that, and most organizations that we talk to now have a mobile first strategy. It's how can you get your customers to engage through their mobile, and then that communication within a mobile, you've got so many different channels available, and it's the channel. It's a couple of things. It's the channel that is most available, freely available, but also which is the one that's most applicable for the communication that you're trying to achieve.
And I suppose there's a little bit of like, if you send out a message, do customers want to be able to respond in that same form and almost like complete the transaction almost like in the same form? So if you send a message out and it's like, well, then call in, then it's kind of like it's two different. It's like chalk and cheese to a certain extent. You sort of like saying one thing and then come in a different kind of manner. So is that an important theme?
I think there's two aspects to that actually. There are you're right. People like that ability to stick with the communication channel that they're on. So if they receive an SMS, they reply with an SMS. If it's a DM Twitter, they reply on the same channel. That's fine to a point if it's just a reminder. Have you paid? Yes, thank you. But I think there's also that element of being able to promote certain channels or certain communications from one channel to the next. From a customer's perspective. So it could be, oh, by the way, you're late with this bill. Remember to log in and pay that bill. So you go from one channel to another channel. But equally, from an organization's perspective, there might be times where you go from open public communications to something that's very private, which needs to be validified, and you need to log onto your account or something like that. So you go from a Instagram message or a Twitter message or an SMS actually to then logging onto your account, which is great from an asynchronous and a communication and a channel perspective. But one of the challenges that organizations have is how do you then monitor that communication? And that's something we're seeing a huge drive towards. So you may start with a reminder in SMS or a reminder in push, but what happens if that customer panics or needs to speak to somebody? Then when they do come through to the contact center, how does that agent manage that communicate and must be able to see the transition from the channels that's been applied there. And that's really important, not only from a customer experience perspective, but also from an agent's perspective. How do they, if suddenly I call in and everybody gets it, hi, good morning, Neil, how can we help you today? That's really frustrating. And so organizations need to be able to see that the channel, the flow of the calls and the communications that's gone on.
And I suppose that's a natural evolution, is it, of the fact we've got more messaging out there, we've got this digitalization. Is like, omni-channel has to come with that. That's really what you describe. It has to come with that. Otherwise, people are just going to get lost if you just have separate channels going off everywhere.
Exactly, and that's the big challenge that most organizations have. In the old days, it would be, okay, so we've got voice sorted, we've got our web presence, now we'll do email, and so it was very much siloed approach that an organization would have. That doesn't work anymore. That just provides such a terrible siloed approach from an organization's perspective, but also from a customer's perspective. Is if I know I'm receiving an email and an SMS and a push notification, I expect that the person, the organization that I'm dealing with, to know that they've sent that email and that SMS, and especially if I'm then going to phone and have a conversation with them, I expect that to have been measured and tracked all the way through.
I suppose there's two challenges with that. One is almost like you need the decisioning and the science around, well, what is the right channel? So if it's vulnerable or financial difficulties, then maybe you want to have that conversation on a call. There might be a trigger, but when is that, and when does that happen in the journey versus not? So all that sort of science needs to come up with, needs to be included. And then the other piece is then how do you measure that, right? So what is a good outcome? So one of the challenges would be, like, you send an SMS, and how do you measure if that SMS is successful or not? Because it might result in a call, it might result in a website hit, and they can come in lots of different ways. And the more channels you have, the more complex it becomes.
That is a real challenge, and we work really hard with our customers to be able to that's partly the key element of where IMI fits in, is to be able to orchestrate all of those communications in one place, so that you don't get those siloed data entries, but also from a customer experience perspective, how do you measure all of those processes? And quite rightly, how do you measure the success of that? So we do a lot of A/B testing,
Mhm.
where we'll work with one department that has something that may be regulatory. So let's understand what the regulation piece is and understand how the messages can be built in that way. But also link that in with the marketing team as well,
Mm,
because
mm.
there's nothing worse than a customer that may have forgotten to pay a bill and then suddenly at the same time getting a marketing message saying, "Hey, apply for this new credit card," or "We're
Yeah,
looking."
yeah.
And those are simple things, and you would expect them to be tracked and caught. But in a lot of certainly financial organizations, all of those old siloed services, it's very difficult to bring those together. And we work really hard at being able to bring all of those together.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it can be it can be a challenge sometimes, and particularly when you've got like big organizations and big machines that have sort of been working in the background. We should talk a bit about vulnerability and financial difficulty. I mean, that's obviously been, we've just been through we're going through the pandemic. I mean, have you seen that take place? And I suppose is what will be the impact on messaging? How can messaging in particular deal with some of that, or does it always have to be on the phone?
Absolutely not. And we're seeing a massive drive away from the phone,
Mm,
as we've mentioned earlier. A, because of the cost from an agent's perspective, and also that customer experience as well. Quite often, it's much easier if you can have a softer conversation with a customer that may be in some difficulty. And that can be built up from softer communications like an SMS or a push or
mm,
a Twitter feed or something like that, some softer, and also using the channel that customers are more comfortable with using.
mm,
Um, and then, as you say, sometimes that does then promote into a voice call, and we're seeing a lot more activity now around not only that element of information that has got to be part of it, but also how an agent deals with that call and the person on the end.
mm,
So we work a lot with housing associations, for example, where traditionally they have a lot of vulnerable customers. So we're seeing not only how technology and messaging channels can help in that communication and sort of ease the
mm.
level and the rising level of that interaction, but also from an agent's perspective as well. If um, we've seen it actually quite a lot during the pandemic, where there were some, a big rise in vulnerable customers, is how the effect that has on the agent as well.
Mm.
And if you can use a technology and provide a messaging structure that eases the communication with the customer, then by the time it's promoted to a voice call, which inevitably it is, then the agent has knows the steps that have been put in place, can see what the journey has been up to that point, and also can have things in place to have a more productive conversation.
Mm.
Because we're seeing, regulations are coming in now around how you deal and how you explore whether a customer is a vulnerable customer or not, on the levels of vulnerability as well.
Mm.
So technology can help, and it's what are the channels that are being
Yeah.
used to be able to enable that.
Yeah, I think you raised quite an interesting point there around, so certainly in the collections world, it would be, or in customer care world, it's kind of like, well, we want to get it overdone. This first contact resolution, we want to get it over and done in one go, right? And so that might turn into a letter that is like, 3 pages long because we want to give people all the information and we want to be done. Or it might be a call that takes place and it's sort of like it's a 20-minute call because you want to talk about everything, right? But actually the messaging piece could actually lead to a different type of outcome, which is almost like little steps, right? So it's like, here's a step, digest that. Here's another step, digest that. Here's another step, digest that. And you're taking people on a journey to get to the point that might be right for them, but it's less of a shock, if you see what I mean. So it's like, you're giving them the options, but they need time to digest what the options are, as an example.
Yeah.
And so you can sort of break that over time. I mean, is that are people using it in that kind of way?
Yes, we're seeing that in use already. We're seeing some of our customers are already starting with those micro steps. And so the traditional process would be, let's see, it's now a 30-day debt. We'll send a letter, we'll make a phone call, and it becomes a terrible experience because it was a very expensive piece of process to go through. But now, if you can start with much lower cost, but much gentler messages, and we're seeing some really startling results actually by just that pre-warming of a conversation. Just by sending an SMS or by sending a push notification, or by the way, and that's just that ping of a reminder is generating a lot more engagement, and people, damn, yeah, I forgot to do, so that that early recovery is starting to grow.
What do you think the impact's going to be on the call centres? So obviously, we had large voice call centres for a while. We're now moving to messaging and voice, so it's sort of a blended kind of call centres. I mean, how do you think the role of agents are going to change, and the roles of call centres, collections and customer care call centres are going to change? How's it going to evolve?
I think it's going to evolve very rapidly, actually. I think the term contact center agent will disappear, because I think there will be much more of a consultative person on the end of the phone, because by the time you end it with a live voice engagement or a live call, there's a number of steps that have gone up to that point, and so the engagement could be a little bit longer, but a much more fulfilling engagement with the customer. Whereas I think the agents will be a much higher level training, and that the way in which they interact is going to be much more of a caring and a much more of a compassionate role, where you are delivering more of a solution rather than just getting a payment if it's in a collect program. And that engagement with that customer not only proves to be much more fulfilling engagement, but also the perception that they have of your organization as well. I mean, ultimately there's a debt to be repaid, but hopefully you end up with a much more fulfilling engagement on the back of that, and you're not in that position, and being able to help a vulnerable customer, I think is a much better place to be for an organisation. And we've seen that. Will we see some regulation come from that? I think we are already seeing that, but I think a lot of organisations are going to be much more proactive.
I mean, and what are you hearing in terms of volume that's coming out from the pandemic? Do you think that's going to kind of hit us? I mean, do we need to get ready for that now? Because it feels like it's been quite benign, actually, the last year or so, really, because of the support measures, which have been great for folks. But you just wonder if there's a big volume that's sort of sitting out there. I know people are worried about it.
Yes, it's going to be interesting. And if you look at the results of some of the surveys, you've seen quite a shift in debt levels. In certain areas have gone very high, but actually in other areas they've gone very low. And so there's a lot of pent up funds that people are wanting to spend. So I think that there's going to be a big push towards the credit card market, but on the other end. So I think the gulf between the two is quite wide, and there will be, I think, once the things start to ease up, there will be quite a big push in both the credit card area, but also in the collections area, because some people have been hit really hard. So that vulnerable process is going to become much more prevalent, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose it's volumes. You're going to get this realignment, right? And the things are almost like going to crystallize, and And then I suppose you have to be ready from just a volume point of view, because I suppose that's the concern. That was the concern this time last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so we at the beginning of the pandemic were sending out millions and millions of SMS messages, informing people of what can be done, and that was a very asynchronous process. What we're seeing now is we're not seeing those massive volumes of SMS messages, but at an evening out of a lot of the other channels as well.
Yeah.
And so that it's that spread which we're seeing now.
And I suppose just on going back, how do you feel about working remotely? I mean, how's IMIMobile sort of dealt with that? But this was also, there's quite a bit of chat now around returning to the office. I mean, I think it was Google sent out those, it was in the news yesterday, around sort of 3 days a week and sort of those kind of things. How have you handled it in terms of your personal experience or your team's experience? And what do you think how do you think it's going to evolve?
Again, I think there's probably going to be two camps here. Certainly where I live, I'm quite happy to work remotely, and it's worked really well for a lot of my colleagues. We have a London office, and some of the guys are very keen to get back into that. I know from a contact center perspective, HSBC have said that they're going to close a lot of their office-based contact center and continue to work from home. But I think it's JP Morgan saying they need to get people back in the office.
Yeah.
So it's going to be I think certainly there will never be a wholesale move back to massive contact centers again. Now that we've got cloud contact centers, we've got remote working, it works really well for the agent from an agent's perspective. So I think that is here to stay. It's absolutely here to stay. But I think there's certainly that you do miss that office chat and that being able to just walk over to somebody's desk and ask a bit of advice.
It seems like there's lots of ideas out there in terms of like, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to be completely remote, we're going to be a little bit on site, or you all need to be back in the office starting June. That's also out there as well. And everyone's sort of circling around, just saying, well, where is it going to land? I think, and I don't think we really know yet. I think we've got quite strong opinions one way or the other, but it almost like it's going to be interesting to watch to see how it lands. I think in terms of how we go back.
Yeah, I don't think it will be a mass return. For sure, and it'll probably take a couple of years just to settle down again. But I think what's really being proved without a doubt is that the technology works. It's there, and you can run a massive organization remotely, and the benefits that brings for employees against how the rest of the organization works.
Yeah, I think it's sort of also slayed that a little bit, that you can trust people to work remotely as well. I think there's always a bit of fear in the back of people's mind, but I mean, if people have really stepped up to the plate and sort of, I mean, we can be trusted, right? So I think that sort of comes through too.
Yes, yeah, and certainly we've been incredibly busy, and I think one of the challenges is actually being able to turn off at the end of the day. And you think, well, my laptop's here, I'm all set up, I've got things I need to do. Being able to be prescriptive about, right, no, need to turn off and let it go.
Actually turn the laptop off.
but actually, sometimes it's really handy to know that it's there, and you can, you have an idea, you just go back and you sit in the quiet of the day, or the quiet of the night, should I say, to be able to think straight for a few minutes. No,
exactly. Okay, that's great. So lastly, I suppose, what do you think the future is going to bring? I mean, we've talked a bit about digital adoption, these things have been around for a while. I mean, what's out there now that you think we're going to evolve, that will be the next almost like wave that comes through after, because this was around for a while and now it's been adopted, but what's developing now is going to be the next thing that will be adopted, do you think?
I think certainly some of the rich communication channels are starting to emerge. RCS is going to be huge, where you get a much more rich experience on your mobile. As I said before, mobile first. Everybody's moving that way, and what you can see on the screen is and being able to see that in a really rich and involving way is going to be a real key battleground, and making sure all of the technology behind that works and that it's secure and that you can see how you can have a free and engaging conversation, but also that it's secure and that you have we do a lot of fraud protection work as well. And we're seeing a lot of activity in that area, mobile fraud, and how do you prevent that? So we're doing a lot of work in that area as well. We're seeing a massive growth and a lot of development to make the mobile device secure.
Yeah, and I suppose the mobile first strategy also comes with, you've got to make it visible on the screen, and it's a small amount of real estate essentially. So there's a bit of design thinking there as well, in terms of like, how do you make it simple? How do you think about the process design to make it straightforward? How does it link in with the data? You know, and everything needs to link together with the comms as well, I would imagine.
Yes, yeah, making it frictionless. That's the sort of mantra that we have, is making it secure and frictionless and an engaging application. If you can capture all of those three things, then you're going to be winning. And Google, Apple are really focused on being able to drive that. And we're seeing a lot of early adopters in that area now, seeing some great results, where you are seeing a really rich experience, where you get a great interaction for a customer who. And it's that interaction that really counts, because people remember, if something is slick, easy, and simple to do and works first time, then people will remember that app and remember that engagement. And that's the sort of the goal that everybody's
aiming. That's the win.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, Neil, thanks very much for making the time. I really appreciate it. And I agree. I think the messaging piece has been sort of dynamite over the last 12 months. I remember when I first saw it, I thought it was fantastic in terms of getting hold of people. So, and I think it's been an interesting 12 months. So I really appreciate your insights and sort of hearing how things have been going, really. So
great. Thanks very much for your time, Chris.
Yeah.